Well, hello everyone, and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is for you dialing in to join us today. Thank you so much for making the time and for your commitment to this topic, for this webinar on how to help children continue to learn during COVID-19. I'm told that this is the second in the Aga Khan Foundation UK series on COVID-19 related webinars. That really explore the impact of the pandemic on developing world contexts. The previous recording can be found at akf.org.uk, and I'm excited and reliably informed that the numbers of you dialing in today have completely smashed the previous record of that webinar. We're expecting somewhere between 500 to 600 people dialing into this call today, which is just fantastic. So again, thanks so much for making the time. Before we dive in, I have 2 points of housekeeping. The first one is on Q&A. I'm sure you're all quite familiar with these webinars now, given how deep we are into the COVID response. But you will be able to see at the bottom of your portal an ability to submit questions. I strongly encourage you to do so, as I will be selecting the best questions, the hardest questions at the end, and putting them to our fantastic panel. So please, if there is anything you want to ask, do use that feature. If you're dialing in from Facebook Live or viewing this on YouTube, then sadly you will not be able to ask a question. Takes me to my second point of housekeeping. This is being recorded. So if you are not comfortable with being on a recorded webinar, that's absolutely fine. Please, if you can drop off the line now, and then be sure to check back and view the recording on the AKF website. If we could go to the next slide, I'll cover who we are. Perfect, thanks. And who we are, we have Dr. Andrew Cunningham, who is one of the global leads for education at the Aga Khan Foundation. The other global lead for education at the Aga Khan Foundation is Nafisa Shekhova, joins us as well, both based in Geneva. And Margery Evans is also on the line, the academic director for the Aga Khan Education Services. And making up the quartet is myself, Ronan Ferguson. I'm a manager from Accenture Development Partnerships, which is the social impact arm of Accenture, which is a global management consulting firm. And there are no prizes today for guessing who the odd one out is of that quartet. So rather than typing in your first question of who are you, Ronan, and what are you doing here, I would just like to kind of preempt that question by saying I had the great pleasure of working with Andy recently on a project that was 8 weeks long for Schools 2030. And we were working on, I suppose, bringing a bit of structure to internal communications and knowledge management. And I think the reason that I was asked to host this webinar was that in that 8-week project, we achieved some pretty remarkable things, but we had to come and approach that project as Accenture Development Partnerships and as the Aga Khan Foundation in a pretty new way because of COVID. And I think that's a running theme through this presentation, is actually seeing COVID as an opportunity to do things slightly differently, and often to achieve, or potentially to achieve, better results. So hopefully that theme will keep re-emerging throughout the webinar. If we could go to the next slide, please. Just going to signpost the agenda so that you know that you're going to, the next hour will be well invested from your standpoint. What we hope you'll get out of this event is a set of resources and access to those resources that are going to support families and educators to help children learn during this time. These resources have been developed by the Aga Khan Education Services and by Aga Khan Foundation. And I'm going to essentially hand over to this talented team to walk through the 3 pillars of the Aga Khan Development Network's COVID response framework, the third pillar of which is essentially minimizing impact on communities. And underpinning that third pillar are 3 more pillars. Nafisa is going to walk you through what those pillars are. Then she's going to take on a deep dive into that first pillar, which is looking at supporting families. We're going to go to Margery for pillar 2 on supporting educators, and Andy will complete the trifecta on an overview of supporting school systems, again, to help children learn. And then we will come back to me, who will launch off on the Q&A. So again, please do keep those questions coming in. They'd be gratefully received. In terms of just some high-level thoughts from me, I'd like to ground this webinar in the context of COVID's impact on the global education system. And I'd like to do this, first of all, by considering the what so of COVID's impact on the global education system, and then moving to the second half, which is the so what of that impact. And what's so right now is that there are some 1.6 billion children, basically 90% of the world's student population, that are out of school across 190 countries. And almost a quarter, I think it's 23% of those students that rely on school meals as a key source of nutrition are not getting those meals, and those meals are not being replaced. Now, necessity often is the mother of invention, and we've seen some really quite innovative, remarkable responses from different countries, and I'd like to call out a couple that have been my favorites. Ukraine, for bringing its entire education curricula online as a result of COVID, quite a remarkable thing to do. North Macedonia, which has succeeded in shifting its classrooms into living rooms by recording its classroom sessions and putting them through television. But sadly, another what so of where we are as a planet right now is that half of the world's pupils don't have access to a household computer. And according to UNESCO, 32 countries will end the academic year online, but 100 countries have not yet even announced a date for schools to reopen. Now, many of these developing countries are trying to innovate and find other ways to bring their classes to the masses. And again, a few favorite examples: Rwanda turning to broadcasting through radio, Cote d'Ivoire going for videotape lessons that are broadcast, Sierra Leone, really fascinating, pioneering, trying something new around a dial-a-teacher service. So you can phone in and get a teacher one-on-one hotline, essentially, for delivering a class. So in wrapping up the what so, many of the world's children have now been out of school for over 6 months. And for approximately 890 million students, the school calendar has never looked so undefined. So what? I'd like to consider the so what across 3 threads, and I think these 3 threads will be coming again through this webinar quite loud and clear at you. The 3 threads are pupils, the families, the teachers. So the so what for the pupils, it's really not hyperbole to say that the fallout of the decisions that are being made today will follow a generation of school children for the rest of their lives. It's well documented that less instructional time leads to lower educational attainment. And it's not just the educational attainment. We all know that schools are more than places of learning. They provide students with that social protection, the nutrition, the psychosocial support that is normally forthcoming from both teachers and friends, which is lost in the current environment. The second thread is families. Families have now been burdened, and I think burdened is the right word, with the responsibility of not only meeting their children's educational needs, but balancing their own work commitments. And the sad, predictable future of this is that closing schools will expound inequality because children from lower socioeconomic families will be disproportionately affected. And the third thread is the impact on educators. And gosh, these are so wide-ranging, ranging from the financial impact, being away from work, the stress of how to make up for lost learning time, 6 months, and health. Will it be safe for these critical frontline workers to teach full classrooms? What's the balance to be struck between going back quickly and going back safely? The classroom is the front line of COVID when it comes to proximate transmission of the virus. And I think one thing that unites teachers the world over is their courageous attitudes and their pioneering natures in this crisis. Again, and one of my favorite examples is in Namibia, pioneering teachers texting the parents of their students through WhatsApp or through SMS to simply check in on how the lessons are progressing, if there's anything that the parents need in terms of getting a concept that they perhaps don't understand and unblocking them in that way. It's almost like it's a parents' evening, a daily parents' evening, but the subject of the talk is the performance of the parent rather than the child. Ultimately, 6 months have been lost from many academic calendars. COVID is forcing the education sector to do things differently. This is our collective opportunity to build back better. And I assert that that's a mantra that is partly what's brought many of you onto this call today. So our speakers are going to share with you a series of available tips, the recommendations, learning resources that are available both online and offline, to help us build back better, to support families and educators to help children learn during this time. So with that, Nafisa, I shall hand over to you.
I'm muted. Okay. Thank you, Ronwin, and hello, everyone. So I think before going into more education, I think I'll be talking about a bit briefly about the AKES response framework. So as the Aga Khan development is a network of agencies that is involved in social, economical and cultural programs. So when COVID expanded rapidly across the world and hit many of our countries, the AKES developed an institutional and a coordinated response to ensure that in the countries where we work, that all our agencies are responding to this disaster and this uncertainty with a coordination and institutional framework. So a global framework was developed that was really guiding our countries in their responses, but really taking into account the needs, context, and the reality in each of the countries. At the global level, we established a global task force, and then at the national level in each country, there was also a national task force to make sure that there was a coordination and implementation. Next slide. So the global response framework for AKES has 3 pillars. Pillar 1 is around slowing and stopping the transmission, preventing the outbreaks and delay and suppress the spread. So in this one, it's the AKES agencies that are involved in the civil society work, but also a lot of our health agencies and programs that were really taking lead in this pillar. Pillar 2 is around providing optimized care for all patients, especially for the severely and critically ill patients. And again, in here, given that the Aga Khan Development Network has hospitals and clinics, but also works with thousands of government and other partners, health institutions and services, Pillar 2 was also really our health organizations that were leading it. Pillar 3 is around minimizing the impact on communities, the vulnerable social service and economic activities. So in here, it's our civil society, our economic inclusion, our agriculture and food security, and of course the education services that are programs that are part of the Pillar 3. Next. So within the Pillar 3, if we're looking at the AKES agency, there are 5 agencies that have been that are involved in education. It's the Aga Khan Education Services, Aga Khan Academies. We have the Aga Khan University and the University of Central Asia, and of course the Aga Khan Foundation. So our education response really needed to look at the 3 areas: families, educators, and schools. That's not just because of the need of the COVID, but also prior to COVID-19. As an agency, we do believe in a whole school approach. We believe that a quality education can only be achieved when we engaged all stakeholders are involved, from students to families to educators and schools. So the 3 are, the first one is really during COVID-19, we were looking at how do we support families with the relevant resources so they can help their children at home. And then, of course, the educators to really look at how the educators can engage with families and children during the confinement and during the current situation. And, of course, supporting the schools when they plan to reopen to address the gaps when we're going to see in learning, but also the safe and healthy, the safety and healthy learning environments for students and for the entire school's staff. Next. So supporting families to help children learn was, of course, our first priority, as many of them were stuck at home. We know with their children, many families felt that they now need to become teachers, full-time teachers, to teach their kids. And we felt that we really needed to prioritize that. We really need to prioritize on how to help families. Of course, as we started looking at it, there was a lot of resources that became available. Both many organizations, many institutions have started developing resources, but also existing companies were providing free online resources. And at some point we felt, and our own colleagues who have children and our staff who have children in the field felt that it was too much overwhelming. So what we did is, we developed three resources. The first one was really just tips. It's really helping families on their day-to-day on what to prioritize during the confinement. It's having from a daily routine, making sure that they themselves are okay, the children are okay, that they don't have to become full-time teachers, that it's okay not to teach their kids every day, and to be really taking things at a time, giving their context and their needs. So this was really just practical tips that we created that we thought that would be useful for the families, parents and caregivers, more importantly. We then developed activities. What we did is we looked at online activities. I think there were around 2,000 online resources that we scanned, and we identified around 75 both online and offline resources that we've prioritized. Again, looking at the accessibility, looking at which one are a bit more simpler for families to really access. Also the ones that are free, really free, because there was some that were not necessarily free. And then because in our context, a lot of families don't have internet, and as you said, Roman, that majority are not yet be reached through the online internet or online services, we really need to come to think through an offline activities. What are the things, basic things that parents can do? And then the third resource is around the psychosocial and well-being. Again, the point that you've raised, that we really prioritized as for the families. We again developed tips on basic tips that parents and adults can do at home, but also for their children, what to prioritize to feel okay, to really prioritize their personal well-being, and also develop some basic activities and shared some existing basic activities that they can do at home. Next. And then the tips for families on supporting children's learning at home, but also on the psychosocial well-being. We then created short videos in English and also many other languages that are available on our blended learning website. They were also shared through social media such as Facebook, as well as WhatsApp. They are in different languages that are available free, and they can be accessible by anyone. Next. Sorry, I'm just, yes. So I think what we've learned and what we really need to, when it comes to parents, I mean, I think the first one is that we do need to continue supporting families because they will, COVID is still here, and parents will continue being involved, remain involved, even if the schools will open, because we know that even if the schools are open, in many of the contexts, kids might not go to school every day. In the countries where we have 100 or 200 kids per classroom, there is no way that all of those kids are going to be, they might even go once a week. So kids will still be at home, and we really need to continue to think on how we will continue supporting parents and families during this very uncertain time. I think the second thing is for us to really think around strengthening the trust and relationship between families and schools during COVID-19. I think this relationship between families and schools, while it has always been a very important factor in supporting kids' learning, whether during COVID or before COVID, it's somehow lost in many of the countries that we started working. What we saw is that families felt that schools are responsible for the education of their children, and the role of parents was also limited. Many parents who are illiterate felt that they can't even go and visit the schools. So I think this is an opportunity for us to really, now that we have this opportunity in terms of the role of parents, the role of communities and families have been so important during this time that we really need to continue strengthening that relationship of trust. And of course, what we see and what we are afraid of, that with the schools being closed for so many months, in some of the countries like Pakistan, in the northern area, schools were never open this year, because the academic year was supposed to start in March, and then they've been on they haven't even started the academic year because they've been on confinement. So we are afraid that in some of these developing countries, parents, and due to economic issues, parents will not be sending back their children, and kids might be dropping out. So the role of families and the role of the local communities in ensuring that all children will come back to school during COVID-19 is very critical. So I think these are the three areas that I wanted to share in terms of thinking through the parents' engagement and community engagement as we continue living through this very uncertain time. So thank you, and over to you, Ronan.
Great, thank you, Nafisa. Well, let me hand straight over to you, Margery, for this second pillar.
Thank you, Ronan. As Nafisa said, it was really important to focus on parents. It was equally important to turn our attention to teachers. And by the time we did that, a number of schools had already been in lockdown, a number of countries had already been in lockdown. So there were 5 really key themes that came out, and the resources that we developed were very much targeted at addressing those themes. Next slide, please. The first was that it wasn't just students that we had to think about their welfare, it was teachers as well. And it was critical that we paid attention to teachers' welfare. And so one of the resources we developed was devoted entirely to educator wellbeing and professional development. The second big lesson that came out for us during this time is that teachers were incredibly time poor. They were trying to be parents, they were trying to cook the meals, they were trying to look after their own children's learning, they were checking in on neighbours, and remote teaching's tricky. It requires technological expertise and pedagogical expertise. So teachers were struggling in terms of the amount of time, they were exhausted. And so our resources are very, very deliberately about doing all the hard work for them, looking at these thousands of resources online and offline and curating them so that they're presented simply and teachers can pick them up. The third big message that came through to us is teachers also miss being with students, and students miss being with teachers and peers. And so threaded through the 4 resources that we produced for teachers, one I said was to do with wellbeing and professional development. The other 3, one was focused on pre-primary, one on primary, and one on secondary. Threaded throughout those resources is a real focus on engaging with students and connecting with students. So there are lots of activities that really develop and emphasise that element. Fourth thing we found out is that we're not ready for remote learning, and Rowan referred to that in his introduction. Not only students, but teachers themselves didn't have access to appropriate devices or needed to share devices, or connectivity was flaky or non-existent. So we've been very, very deliberate in building in robust offline resources that teachers can use so that they don't have to rely on clever downloads from the internet. And the last big message that came through to us very clearly that we've tried to address through these resources is that what works in one circumstance for one teacher in one geography for one age group isn't necessarily going to work in a whole range of others. And so consequently, we tried not to overburden teachers with the range of resources that we provided, but there are 350 plus tips and resources for educators spread through these resources. The resources themselves follow a similar format. Nafisa alluded to it. There's a set of tips that are short and pithy and go to the issues that I've outlined. There are on and offline resources, and they had to pass 3 tests to get into these documents. Nafisa talked about the fact that they need to be free and or inexpensive to execute. They really needed to be simple to do and to understand. Teachers just don't have time to work through a whole lot of instructions. Families at home don't have that time either. And third, they needed to be doable in resource-constrained environments. So we're very confident that the activities that are contained within these resources meet those tests. Also, the resources, not only have we got a resource devoted to teacher wellbeing, but within the other 3 resources are very clear sections on student psychosocial health and wellbeing. So the tips are varied. We've really tried to identify activities that have got some longevity around them, that are potentially repeatable, that engage students in deep learning, and that integrate a range of the subjects that we don't always get to do in depth in 40 and 50-minute periods in schools. So we've really tried to get a real breadth of STEM activities, of literacy activities, of learning languages, of physical activities. So some of my favourites. I love there's one that talks about setting up an obstacle course, and that has not only kids climbing, potentially mums and dads, older siblings set it up, climbing through the clothes horse, but it also has thinking intervals as well, where you might have to write down 5 words that start with C that you can see in the room, for example. Another one I really like for little children is astronauts reading stories from space. Very cool. Another is that older students being journalists and writing about their COVID experience from different perspectives. So the variety, there's a real variety of resources in there. The other thing, next slide please, the other thing that we were really keen to do was not set these as prescriptions, but use them as prompts to encourage people to explore websites, to think about what was relevant in their context. So in our 200 schools across countries, Aga Khan schools across various countries, I've just picked up these images that give you a sense of how people have used and adapted and been prompted by the ideas in these resources. So far left, we've got a little fellow from Mombasa in Kenya doing a really simple task that teachers and parents have been able to set up together, practicing his numbers using art and craft. Top centre, these students are from Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. They are actually representing Tanzania at a debating competition that should have been in Mexico, but now will be held online, so a virtual one. But throughout our resource, we talk about the power of debating, how you can involve students in these sort of interactive processes, whether it's by the telephone or online, to encourage the sort of activities that they would continue, that will continue their learning. On the top right, we have a teacher who is supporting her colleagues with technology and with pedagogy in terms of distant learning, a really strong theme through our educator resources. And the little girl down the bottom in the right-hand corner is engaged in the DEAR project. So Rowan talked a lot about the fact that, you know, we don't have access to technology in a whole range of places. And so DEAR stands for Drop Everything and Read. So simply getting books into the hands of students and having them read them through with parents and siblings has been a fantastic way of maintaining an interest and momentum in learning. For the last, I want to talk to you about the centre bottom photograph. One of the things that's been incredibly important during this time is to think about values. And one of the values that AKDN holds very strongly is that of service. So this little primary school girl from Korog in Tajikistan made 300 pancakes herself, which she then took down to the local school and gave to the frontline, at the local hospital, which she took to the frontline workers and gave to the patients. So again, even though school isn't in session, we can still talk about service and values. Next slide, please. One of the resources that I want to draw to your attention is these 3 videos that were produced by AKF that do exactly that. They talk about inclusive classrooms, classroom learning environments, and really emphasise the importance of service, of inclusivity, of pluralism in these times. Next slide, please. So I am left wondering, as we move into a circumstance that is likely to continue for some time, and we hear lots of noise about learning loss, how we might honour what students have actually learnt when they're at home. They've learnt a myriad of things. How do we honour and recognise that now and when they come back to school? Wellbeing has come through as such a strong theme, as has academic progress. How do we support both of those things as lockdowns and blended learning, is inevitably going to continue for some time? And last, our teachers have done a remarkable job in terms of an emergency response to learning during the COVID period. But how do we lift and sustain that in what I think all of us would agree is going to be the long haul? Thank you, Rowan. Back to you.
Beautiful, Margery. Thanks so much. And yeah, I've not heard of drop everything and read, but that's a good mantra for that. Certainly I'll be following. Thank you. Andrew, let's hand over to you for the third element.
Thanks, Ronan. And again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'd also like to thank Dr. Mahmood, the chairman of the UK National Committee, and members for inviting this webinar to even take place. Nafisa and I were invited to give an overview less than a month ago about the kind of collaborative work and the dedicated commitment of our colleagues throughout the world. And it was thought that actually these lessons learned and insights and resources should be shared more widely. So thank you very much for that invitation. And also I saw in the chat of, well, where are all these resources? How can we get them? So if Christopher Wilton Steer can put in the chat the link at akf.uk.org, all of these resources mentioned by Nafisa and Margery are also downloadable immediately for free. So now, how do we think about these issues around families, around teachers, around pupils, within the future of school systems, particularly when everyone is experiencing an increasingly uncertain time? Within the Aga Khan Development Network alone, it's estimated that we reach approximately 5,000 and more schools every single year in partnership with governments across more than 20 different countries. One of those programs, next slide, was being launched this year called Schools 2030, which was a collaboration and is a collaboration of 9 private foundations supporting 1,000 government schools for the next 10 years across 10 countries to really try to work with teachers and understand what works to improve quality holistic education. But when this program was kicked off in March, as Ronan said, the world's schools closed. Next slide. Within the ethos of Schools 2030, we were enabling teachers to go through a 6-step process to really amplify what works from the bottom up rather than the top down in this international sector we call global education. First, enabling teachers to assess their own learning outcomes, then to design their own solutions, then to receive flexible capital to implement those solutions, to track, iterate, and then showcase to their national governments rather than the NGOs and people perhaps living halfway around the world speaking on their behalf. In fact, Schools 2030 was creating the platform, and now is creating the platform for school teachers to understand what works and actually articulate that to the global audience. Next slide. In March of this year, we were in Nairobi, beginning with that second step of design thinking, listening to pupils, listening to teachers. You can see a wide variety of stakeholders. We had colleagues from Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda all together, figuring out how do we actually enable our students to learn conflict resolution in areas like the slums of Kibera in Nairobi, or in the coastal areas of Mombasa, Kenya. And they were generating these prototypes and bringing in students and bringing in teachers and actually testing these different solutions before going to scale. But then COVID hit literally a week later. Next slide. So we immediately had to shift. How do we keep this kind of energy alive and the participation and the inclusion of teachers in the development of solutions related to now COVID-19 that perhaps could supplement the global resource toolkits that AKF and AKES have been developing so diligently over the last few months. And together with our teams around the world and the Aga Khan Foundation's innovation unit, we used Mural, which is an online platform which basically takes those offline Post-its and makes it interactive in an online way. And taking these challenges that teachers were actually experiencing for, we do not know how to support children's formal learning, we feel inadequate, in turning those into how might we questions? How might we increase caregivers' knowledge and confidence about educating their children? And it's a simple shift of using verbs like motivate, incentivize, provide, support, help, create, and building on what Ronan said in the beginning, COVID-19 can also be an opportunity to do things differently and to feel a sense of momentum. Next slide. After trialing a first few where all of us got quite frustrated because it's very difficult to put on a virtual Post-it what you can put on just with your marker and pen on the wall. But in fact, there was a sense of belonging and there was a sense of creativity that people, although locked in their homes, were able to feel a sense of progress, a sense of invention, and a sense of energy that frankly the societies in which we live are really trying to drain us during this time of isolation. And so over the last 12 weeks, you can see here, it's not just a series of Post-it notes, it's actually a journey. And each week, we come back together across the 10 countries and bring the findings that we have from texting teachers, from calling parents, from WhatsApping students. What do you think about this? And representing their voices into the solutions generation. Next slide. And boy, has it been amazing. Not only working with Accenture Development Partnerships in strengthened use of Microsoft Teams platforms, but also you can see right in the middle here, a colleague and a partner with the Regional Education Learning Initiative in Tanzania, drawing a little bit of her prototype and connecting with our National Coordinator for Schools 2030 in Afghanistan, Morad Shirzad. That would never be possible before. We would have to bring them together. We'd have to do a workshop. We'd have to do all this kind of it. They were actually co-creating together on behalf of their communities and in a way that was again, scaffolded. And when we're thinking about school systems, how do we think about a scaffolded journey over the course of 12 weeks rather than what Margery said as these emergency reflexes? And you see on the right, this is actually a screen grab of a video from a parent who was prototyping in Kenya one of these particular new SMS and WhatsApp-based basically tutorial of how do you use local household items to work with your kids in a play-based methodology for learning improvement. And these are corn cobs. So we got to think about the majority of contexts are not those that have Crayola crayons. We've got to remember that actually in the majority of contexts, what is around the house, what is in the community could in fact be the most relevant teaching and learning materials that perhaps also could bridge this illusion or this divide that there's an illusion between the school and the home and actually make that bridge. Next slide. And I want to now celebrate that we're at nearing the end of these 12 weeks, and each one of the 10 country teams, whether it's in Portugal or Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, or Brazil, they have been working on these prototypes in testing. And I want to just showcase one from India. Many of you, perhaps in the United States and even in other countries, have heard of these boxes of learning that can be delivered upon order on a subscription basis. So in India, there's a company called Flintobox, which for $17 you get a cool box with all these nice activities for kids to use. And basically our team in India said, this is exactly what we need to be doing, but that's too expensive. How do we make it affordable? In addition, how do we make the content and the materials more relevant for the context of those living in Bihar, in urban and peri-urban and rural areas? And third, what about actually connecting this to economic development? So who are the makers of all these materials? We have women's self-help groups within the Aga Khan Rural Support Program and Aga Khan Foundation making masks right now out of cloth and gaining an income. Well, they're not going to make masks forever. Could they be making some of the materials that go into these boxes that are more affordable? And how do the boxes themselves even become part of the learning materials and making the box itself a puzzle? This came from conversations with real teachers, real families who say, great about the digital revolution for COVID-19 education responses, but for those who are disconnected, this may be the answer. And this may be the thematic sort of journeys month to month that come via box that is made by people in their own communities. And how scalable is that globally? And the other ideas coming out of Afghanistan and Pakistan include, as Ronan said, calling a voicemail with teaching tips so that there's a recorded message around how to teach science, or dynamic duos for a new learning program in Pakistan connecting mothers and teachers together. Next slide. So I'm also left with a few how might we questions. How might we learn more about the future of teaching during COVID-19 by listening to more educators who are succeeding against the odds, like we've done over the course of the design thinking? How might we learn more about the future of learning during COVID-19 by engaging more learners themselves in virtual HCD processes for education? And third, how might we learn more about the future of schooling by inviting more schools to innovate and collaborate through virtual human-centered design processes about how best to navigate and thrive during COVID-19? And all of these resources for the Mural webinars and this 12-week course is open source and free and downloadable. This is where we need to change the direction of educational responses. And I'm very proud of my colleagues around the world who have made this possible. Over to you, Ronan. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Andy. Really, really appreciate all of the comments that you've made, Margery and Nafisa as well. And yes, questions have been flying in, so that's fantastic. I'd like just to address some of the questions that have come in around, this all sounds great, but where can I get the resources? Invite you to visit the AKF website. You can see the URL there on the bottom right of the page. That's your one-stop shop, I think, for learning more about these resources. So being able to download them, as Andy said, for free. Understand they're available in multiple languages, video content that is available in terms of interviews on design thinking. So yeah, please do go there as your first port of call. I'd like to, before we go into Q&A, as is my prerogative, kind of pose a question first, if that's all right, for the panelists. It's actually, I want to see if we could learn a bit more about solutions and get a sense of reality from the ground, essentially, and understand that we do have someone on the line, Aryan Sanyal, who is Aga Khan Foundation's education manager in India. Aryan, can you hear me and can you come off mute? I'd be really interested in hearing your take on Learning Toolkit solution and why you believe that this solution is so critical for helping children to continue to learn during COVID in India.
Thanks, Ronan, for the question. the challenge we faced was that in low internet environments, one of the first challenges was how do we enable parents who do not have access to internet to engage with children and continue learning at home. So a lot of places in India where we work, we are faced with low literacy environments, families, parents who are not literate, they have low access to technologies and they don't have the resources. A lot of them belong to extremely poor households. And COVID has also added to this loss of livelihoods. So like Andy mentioned, we were looking at solutions and trying to brainstorm. And one of the things that came across was these subscription services like flintobox. But even something like $10, $12 a month is not affordable. So the challenge was, how do we come up with solutions that are affordable to the majority of the population? And how do we make this learning kit more affordable to a larger part of the population? And how do we make the resources low cost? Can we use materials that can be used in multiple ways instead of single use? And one of the things we are trying to do is keep it to a target of, say, something as low as $2, so that not only can we provide it, but in the longer run, parents can buy it locally themselves and on a monthly basis. So we're trying to innovate around that. And we're starting with simple things. So like it could be simple materials like paper and color pencils that help children draw. But how do we move on to content, learning content, which is more relevant, thematic content, which is linked to their immediate environment, the rural life, and also linking it to the existing curriculum, the school curriculum itself. One of the major challenges with any such solution is the supply chain. How do we reach the last mile? And there's also this challenge of rural livelihoods in COVID. So like Andy mentioned, we were very inspired by the women's self-help groups who have taken the lead in making masks in their communities and to protect their families and communities. And we wondered, why can't they make simple cards with cardboard? Can we make it possible for them, give them the schematics, and maybe they would be able to do it easily, delivering at the last mile and further lowering the costs as well. And that's something we are going to explore in the next stage. Right now, we are just trying to innovate, get the user feedback, the parents and the children see how they use it, and then lower the cost further and then work with the self-help groups.
That's fascinating, Ayan, and it reminds me a little bit of a project I was working on in India with children in the first 100 days. Like, it is key for their development, and this box innovation was what a social enterprise was coming up with to stimulate children in the first 100 days mentally, to have them develop positively. One of the innovations that they had was to charge two different boxes. So you had a $2 box and you had an $8 box. And actually it was a kind of cross-subsidization program where the $8 box for the higher socioeconomic family actually cross-subsidized and lowered the price point for the $2 box. So there's a lot of great thinking out there. But it sounds like you're well on top of it. But yeah, great for cross points of learning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I'd love to dive into some of the questions that you have been putting to us. And I think the first set of questions that are kind of grouping are around preschool. So let me just find, there were certainly two questions that were quite common there. So Ashifa, thank you for your question. Is distance learning for preschool effective? Would be the first one. And there was a similar question, but you've swamped me. So let's go with that now around the team.
I can answer. I can go with that, and then Margery can. So I mean, I think what we've when we were developing the resource as well, we were kind of saying that we don't have a choice. A lot of the kids are at home right now, and when we're looking at the preschoolers, when we're looking at the distance, there is an option of distance just learning at home offline, or is it the distance having that online time, right? And we know that younger kids cannot have as much, they can't, their spend in terms of spending that much time. One is not good, but two is that kids are not going to be able to sit in front of something for so long. So we are suggesting that, for preschoolers, if parents or even teachers are thinking of activities online, it shouldn't be more than 20 minutes. Or 25 minutes. But then, of course, if it's a distance learning, it's the same, even if it's an offline activities. You can't keep your kids for so long, and that's why even in a preschool settings, whether it's even an offline, when you see that there is a daily routine and kids move quickly from a learning alphabets, then jumping around and running around. So I think we've suggested to both families and also educators that first of all, being a bit more creative, coming up with shorter activities in terms of timing, but also a lot of it has to be play-based. A lot of it needs to be play-based, so kids really enjoy it. But it's not just, for preschoolers. I think we've really suggested for even the primary and secondary that at home, especially if kids are stuck, the learning should be really fun through play-based, and it could be called a project-based, but really around that would be an important way to learn if kids are learning away from their peers and with adults.
Thanks, Nafisa. And whilst I have you, I found Shamir's question now. So, and I think you touched certainly on one of them. Could you please highlight some of the critical issues for preschools? How are teachers engaging students? Are there any best practices emerging? So I think you covered on attention span. Is there anything else you'd like to expand on there?
I mean, I think, as I said, I think play is an important one, is what we suggested in the preschool package for educators, is thinking through how the preschool, for the preschoolers, our recommendation was that they really need to talk to the parents more rather than directly to the students. And also parents, if they want to engage kids on a Zoom or something, parents will always have to be present. Adults always needs to be present, but a lot of the communication during the remote learning will have to be with families, and understanding families' schedule, what the availability on helping young kids is very critical. Margery, anything in you?
Nothing really more to add, Nafisa, except coming back to my theme that learning happens in a whole lot of different ways and a whole lot of different environments. And so little ones helping mum fold the washing, or counting the steps, all of these are ways of engaging students little ones in learning. And so I think we need to recognise that learning doesn't have to be formal. It doesn't have to be painting over numbers. There can be a whole range of other things.
Thanks, Margery. I'll take Mukhtar's question here. Have you considered it as part of this package anything that is more along the alternate learning needs, such as ADHD or deaf children?
So perhaps just answering a little bit from our end, one of our partners globally is the Aga Khan Foundation. That is a key partner for the Schools 2030 program. And the current resource packages do not address this directly. However, over the next couple of months, we are also bringing a number of different insights from really more high resource contexts and making them more relevant to low resource ones. So please stay tuned would be the short answer.
Got you, thanks, Andy. Shashank, thank you for your question. You rightly note it is also hard to reach children with uneducated parents. So solutions prepared material in local languages, as well as some places with no audio instruction. How relevant is what you've developed to families fronted by uneducated parents?
Perhaps I can respond to that one, Ronan. We have in Afghanistan, we face exactly the same problem. Parents are willing and keen, but literacy levels are low. And so there's a whole range of different strategies we've used. Things like talking to parents on the telephone. So with in collaboration with a telecommunications company, Roshan, we've provided SIM cards for families and teachers so that they actually do have their data bundles necessary to take calls. So teachers can talk to parents. We've produced, or the Afghan team have produced illustrative posters that help parents understand some of the tasks that need to happen. There are of course people in communities themselves who are very, very willing to help their neighbours. So, and students themselves can talk to parents. So it's really a matter of being creative, trying different solutions and playing to the willingness of parents to provide the support that's necessary.
And just to add, we've also, for example, again, in Afghanistan, our team for primary and secondary student created self-learn packages where they were then distributed, because again, we didn't also have an online ability, so it was an offline. They were printed and they were distributed by community health workers or others who were taking other stuff to the homes, and then they were given to the students, left at their home or through a community leader. So the kids will receive a self-help learning packages, and then as Margery said, teachers will then follow up with a phone to really help those students whose parents might not necessarily be able to help them with the learning.
Great, thanks Nafisa, thanks Margery. Dr. Lakshmi, thank you for this question. Children will be feeling lonely and sometimes depressed sitting inside four walls, concentrating online. How about meeting their needs in terms of physical education? Are there any interactive sessions that you've seen that work well that you would recommend?
Thanks, Ronan. Well, as a son of a psychologist who's also on the line, who also contributed to some of the different psychosocial well-being and support reference materials, this is a crucial area to not only think about mental health of dialogue and emotional support, but also physical activity. And actually within the resource toolkit, we've selected 3 very useful series of physical education activities that are not just here's a YouTube and watch it, which could be fun once in a while, but actually is a full 19-week program that is also accompanied with why you're doing these particular exercises and learning about the connection between the physical health and the mental health, and be more than happy to follow up to point you right to that, but it's within those resources.
Great, thanks Andy. Helen, thanks for your question here. So thinking ahead to when we're supporting children returning to school, are there ideas to be taken from the programs for recruiting and enrolling children into school in the first place? Programs to retain, like girls, disabled students to remain in secondary schooling. Do we need completely new strategies, or can we, I suppose, look to previous good work that's been done?
I mean, I think one of the things that has helped us even before the COVID, and what I've mentioned, is around communities engagement and getting really communities involved. And I think what we've also learned during this pandemic, that it was actually local communities, it's the local civil society organization that were actually more important, and they were closer to the community, they were closer to the families than many of us and many of the, even governments who were able to provide a national level response, but at the local level it was really community. So if we're looking at getting students back to school, and we have to work very closely with the communities who are close to those families. The community engagement, this family engagement is very critical for us to start now and engage. And actually we have a resource that we should be hopefully in the next 2 weeks, which really for educators on opening schools, and there are tips and activities that we're suggesting in that package, specifically for teachers, on strategies that they can use on helping kids to come, helping families and kids to prepare and come back to school.
Fantastic, thanks Nafisa. Well, we've ticked around to the full hour. There's a lot of questions here that are unanswered, so but thank you so much for your interest. And we will look to take some of these questions away and assess if there's anything that we haven't covered and get some more full answers to you as part of this webinar. Thank you so much for dialing in. I hope you found it useful. Please do go and find and use and share those resources that are available. And yeah, have a fantastic rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.